Hi, I'm Leslie Hitchcock with Resilience Media, and I am here with the author of Freedom's Forge, Arthur Herman. Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today. It's
It's a
great to
pleasure
have
to be
you
here
here.
with you.
We have been talking at Resilience Media about Freedom's Forge in almost every single conversation we've been having as we've been leading up to the Future of Defense Tech Manufacturing and Innovation event, which is happening.
It's marvelous.
Yes, very soon. And so we're thrilled to be able to talk with you because, perfectly honestly, your book was the impetus for why we're doing this event. So can you tell us a little bit of background about you and then we'll get into a conversation about the book.
Sure. Currently, I'm with the Hudson Institute, working I've been a senior fellow there since 2014, and I've been working on a number of technology issues, advanced technologies like AI and quantum. But my original background is in history. And the book that you're talking about, that everybody's talking about right now, Freedom's Forge, was published in 2012. So it's been around for a while. And when I originally wrote the book it was an attempt to tell a story that hadn't really been told very much about the World War II experience, particularly the American experience, which was the way in which private industry and private industry leaders had been mobilized well before Pearl Harbor in order to bring America up to speed to fight modern mechanized warfare of the kind that was being unleashed by Nazi Germany in Europe, but then also the kind of advanced military capabilities that Imperial Japan was showing off in the war in China in the Pacific. And it was about really how this production miracle, which everyone has recognized was the key to American success in World War II, but really key to the Allied success in World War II, the creation of the arsenal of democracy, was not something that just sort of sprang up fully clothed and fully grown from the mind of Washington bureaucrats or of a military industrial complex that was ready to fight this kind of war. There was no military industrial complex. It's part of the book, part of the theme of the book is that that America was in effect having to go from a standing start to becoming the major producer of war material in the course of the war. So much so, in fact, that it was American factories and plants and shipyards and facilities that supplied two-thirds of all of the war material used by the Allies in World War II. That's including the Soviet Union. That's including Great Britain. That this was this artesian well of productivity, but also innovation that was set in motion by a handful of private business people working at the behest of Franklin Roosevelt and his team in the White House, who were able to bring this about and really transform America's industry from one which was still recovering from the Great Depression in 1940 to bring it from an industry which was geared solely towards commercial and consumer goods and services to one that could meet the needs for modern warfare on a scale that no one had really even imagined or thought about before the project got underway. And also, and it's an important part of the book, at the same time, without shutting down the civilian economy. I
Right.
think that's one of the astonishing things that people realize. The greatest military industrial complex ever built. At the same time, the civilian economy in America was still growing.
Hmm.
That was, I think, a tribute both to the economic powerhouse that was America in the 1930s and 1940s, in spite of the Great Depression,
Right.
but also a tribute to how this ability to channel and to unleash that industrial potential and power
Hmm.
to achieve a urgent and really necessary public imperative, which was we are going to be facing war, at least on one front, possibly two, and we need to have an American military which is ready to confront this and prevail. And that's what the Freedom's Forge is all about, is
Right.
how that productive forces came to be unleashed and how that was able to be fulfilled.
Right. So, by comparison, if we're looking at now
Yeah.
to before the war and after the war, how prepared is the West today for major conflict?
Well, I think, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why this book has now taken on increasing relevance, even urgent relevance
Hmm.
in policy circles in Washington, and also as I'm finding out elsewhere too,
Right.
in Europe and Australia, the same concerns growing that are we really ready to
Right.
deal with the possible threat of not just kinetic conflict, but also with a near peer competitor. And now China, I think we have to say, is no longer just a near peer, it's a
Right.
peer competitor.
Right.
But also, do we have, are we building the right kinds of systems for our defense posture? Are we doing this in a way that really is going to provide that level of deterrence to prevent kinetic conflict from
Hmm.
taking place? And I think by and large now the consensus has been on this side of the Atlantic is that our defense industrial base is in serious crisis.
Right.
That at the end of the Cold War, certain key decisions were made with
Hmm.
regard to the shrinking of the number of companies and firms engaged in industrial base
Hmm.
activities for the Defense Department, but also key decisions made about the kind of world that was going to emerge after Cold War.
Hmm.
That America's status as sole superpower was not going to last,
Right.
and that those who had seemed to be our allies in the confrontation with the Soviet Union, and in particular Communist China, might shift from being supportive of United States efforts to win the Cold War to becoming, against its superpower rival, to becoming a superpower rival itself. All of those key perspectives had been pushed aside in the 1990s with an era of complacency. Then came the war on terror
Hmm.
and a focus on small scale conflicts, counterinsurgencies, and suddenly the whole issue of how would we deal with a near peer competitor in terms of large scale conventional arms and the issues that would arise from that for defense industrial base as well as force posture. Those were all pushed aside to deal with the overwhelming priority that 9/11 had brought in dealing with the war on terror. And now I think probably in the last 4 or 5 years, there's more and more realization that we have a lot of time to make up for, not just in the United States, but in the West. And
Right.
I think that a lot of the concern that has been expressed by multiple administrations, not just the Trump administration, first term and now the second, but also the Obama administration expressed similar concerns about whether our NATO allies are up to speed in terms of their spending of percentage of GNP for defense. I see it as something that actually touches on a much deeper issue
Hmm.
than just defense spending. It's about, is the West really prepared? Do we have the tools, the decisive tools that would be
Right.
necessary
Right.
to prevail and to deter such a conflict and to prevail in it, in were it to come? And a realization that we're all kind of in the same boat right now, Leslie. We're all facing the fact that we have a lot of ground to make up for, and that maybe there's key lessons to be drawn from the World War II experience,
Hmm.
the ones that I've outlined and laid out in the Freedom's Forge, that there may be lurking there a paradigm that we can use to mobilize and to rebuild and revive a defense industrial base that's ready to confront that kind of challenge.
Right. Because it's not necessarily a blueprint, but you're right, the paradigm is there. And what was so striking to me as somebody who spent 10 years in Silicon Valley and has been in this industry of startups and technology for nearly 20 years, just how critical innovative thinking was. And there's the startup attitude of move fast and break things, which is rightfully being challenged these days. But they all had to move fast.
It's an Elon Musk
Yeah,
motto.
right,
It is
right.
an Elon Musk
And
motto.
Zuckerberg. But the two heroes of your book, one of them, Kaiser, Henry Kaiser he moved fast and was willing to break things in terms of how things were originally done. The structures in which he was operating in order to be able to, as I think one of the quotes was, "I've never done it before, but I can do it again." That
Yeah,
type
that's right.
of can-do attitude. So,
That's without a doubt, that's hugely important.
right,
And yet there's also something else too when we talk about innovation, which is become such an important word now in a discussion. Defense Innovation Unit. I mean, DIU itself,
right.
it's contained in its title and the work that DIU has doing and it has been doing since its inception, which is
Hmm.
very important. But when you look at the World War II example, you also recognize something else that I think can't be left out of the equation, and that is the innovation has to be supported by productivity.
Yes.
One of the key aspects of the World War II experience was that from the beginning, the architects of the arsenal of democracy turned to the most productive commercial companies
Hmm.
as the place from which they would be able to produce the war material on the scale and in the quantities that would be necessary for modern warfare.
Hmm.
That, and this I think is an important lesson that if you turn to the most productive companies, people, outfits, that you will not only get results fastest, quickest, cheapest,
Hmm.
which of course is very important, but what you also find out is that you also get the most effective innovation at the same time. Because the people in the most productive companies are also thinking about how is it that we can make this better, faster, quicker, and even perhaps change direction in a transformative way in order to achieve our goals and directions.
Right.
Commercial companies, people who work in the private sector, they're in a competitive environment. You always have to stay ahead of your rivals and your peers. You
Hmm.
always have to find a way in which you can deliver a little bit faster, deliver a little bit cheaper, reach more customers and bring them in and keep them there. You're constantly expanding your competitive, your customer base. All of these things are uppermost in the minds of the private sector.
Hmm.
The public sector, people in work in government, don't tend to think in those ways.
No.
And I like to phrase it this way: that for those in the private sector, Silicon Valley, the companies, and in the world of the military as well,
Hmm.
they are dedicated to a sense of making things happen. People in work in government, people who work in large bureaucracies, are dedicated to making sure things don't happen. And sometimes that's a good thing for safety's
Right.
sake, for prudence sake. There's a range of things. But what happened with the World War II example, what happened with the arsenal of democracy, as I explained in Freedom's Forge, is that we found a way to bring the people who make it happen in commercial, the private sector, in industry, and put them together with the people who made it happen on the battlefield or
Hmm.
at sea or in the conflict situations. When you bring those two groups together, then you get some amazing results. And
Right.
the role of government bureaucrats is to sit back, let it happen,
Right.
oversee, make sure you're headed in the right direction, that you're not being detoured in ways that are adverse to the goal of the mission that you're set in motion.
Hmm.
But above all, to let the energy, the productivity, and the innovation of both your defense industrial base and the companies, and the firms, and the people who run it, and that same energy, drive,
Hmm.
productivity, and innovation on the part of your war fighters to bring those two together into into an invincible home.
Right. And I want to I'd like to follow that a little bit more with you because, it is frustrating. I remember when quite a few Silicon Valley execs had gone to the Obama White House and had talked to him about they felt like they could do things better. And he said, well, he explained that it's a bit different in government than it is in business, and we can learn from each other, but we can't emulate each other's work in those in situ together. So there's been frustration, and that was what was so interesting to me to see that innovation and that drive accepted in policy and by the government. And wondering if it is oh, sorry, just one second. My Zoom is being weird. Sorry. That wondering if there is one of the things that came up in the book that I'd love to hear your thoughts on now, kind of thinking about modern day, is that when you involve business people with outside interests helping governments modernize, people raise questions about conflict of interest. It happens across all governments. And then that slows down the potential for everybody to, be able to work together in a really fast way to come together on a problem. Are there any lessons that we can learn from the time that you cover in Freedom's Forge for how to get that balance right today? Because we can all accept, that's why we're doing this particular event. We all accept that we, within manufacturing, defense, security, startups, and the military, that we're not in the right place. But how do we step up to be able to get to the right place as, together with that in mind?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And thinking about that issue, take the question of conflict of interest, for example. Bill Knudsen, the man Roosevelt reached out to put this whole program in motion in the summer of 1940. And as I stressed, that's 18 months before
Right.
Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Was CEO of General Motors.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first companies that he reached out to were companies that worked with General Motors, companies like the Saginaw Steering Gear, for example, and others. So you can imagine there were bound to be questions that arose, like, what's going on here?
Right.
Isn't Bill Knudsen, enriching his company and also the contractors that they work with in this kind of ways? It's just an excuse to do that. Conflict of interest issue arose. But it was important to realize why Bill Knudsen reached out to General Motors companies. Number one was he knew them extremely well.
Right.
He knew those companies. He knew the subcontractors down to the third or fourth level. It made a lot of sense. But he also, of course, reached out to other automobile makers as well. He reached out to Ford. He reached out to Packard because he knew them not quite as well as he did his own company, General Motors. But also, the other reason he did this was because he knew that these were the companies that had the biggest engineering departments.
Right.
And that the biggest problem that America was going to face in building up and going from a standing start to building a modern, effective, invincible military was going to be solving a host of engineering problems, especially converting commercial productive capacity to wartime military productive capacity, and that you needed the best engineers in order to bring this about, to take this place. And in one instance after another, as I explained in the book, a lot of that confidence that he placed in the big engineering firms, and not just in the automotive field, but in electronics companies like General Electric and Westinghouse, and in communications like AT&T, paid off. The example of Saginaw Steering Gear, when they were asked to produce Browning 30 caliber machine guns, they'd never made a machine gun in their lives before. They made steering gear for automobiles, and they signed a contract to produce 2,600 of these 30 caliber machine guns. And when the contract came due, they produced not 2,600 but 26,000. That was the productive capacity that Bill Knudsen was tapping into.
Right.
And so while there were questions that arose, there was one other factor which surpassed everything else, the
Mm-hmm.
priority above all else, and that was the urgency of the situation.
Right.
And when you face an urgent situation, these kinds of questions have to be pushed to the background so you can do the job that's necessary and do
Mm-hmm.
it best and do it fastest and also do it cheapest. And that means that you're going to be looking, again, stress my point, to the most productive companies, the most successful companies. Get
Mm-hmm.
them involved, get them thinking about designing, producing, co-producing with allies, co-producing the systems that you're going to need if you're going to prevail in a decisive contest.
Right.
And
So,
if you're going to be serious, if you're going to be serious about defense industrial base problems, then you're going to have to address those, and the other issues are going to slide into the relative background.
yeah. So then let's shift our focus and go back to the equal power that we were talking about before with China. So they don't have these, concerns about conflicts of interest, and
No, it doesn't
they've got
arise. That's
they've
true.
got very different levers to pull. Um, you know, is there, aside from that, is there something that the West, NATO partners and allies can learn from their industrial strategy?
Well, I think, first of all, I think what we have to say is the Chinese have learned very well from us,
Mm-hmm.
because I know very well that they've studied the World War II example.
Right.
They studied how the U.S. built a military-industrial complex all through the Cold War, which was
Mm-hmm.
extremely effective, including integrating new innovative technologies into stealth technology, GPS, advanced sensors, all of those kinds of things, which became part of the warp and woof
Mm-hmm.
of America's defense establishment and defense posture during the Cold War. They've studied this very closely. They emulated it very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And from time to time, they've shown amazing skill as well in what the real secret to the advantage in all this, and that is not just the productivity, but also the innovation. And they've shown that from time to time. That's popped up in interesting kinds of ways. We think
Mm-hmm.
about, for example, what happened with DeepSeek as an example of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is something missing, Leslie, from the
Right.
Chinese defense industrial base and their entire industrial outlook. And that is that the capacity for real innovation, for real change, lies in the societies which are the most open and have the most free exchange of ideas and exchanges of technology, and
Mm-hmm.
direct and how that points into the future and points in the ways in which that works not only for the larger economy,
Mm-hmm.
but also for how a defense industrial base functions and works here.
Yeah,
And
I
when
would.
you, when you
Yeah.
look at it from that standpoint, I mean, let's take the example of the DeepSeek story, right?
Mhm.
When it first came out, enormous consternation and almost despair in the AI community. Oh my God, if they figure out a way in which costs us tens of billions of dollars, they're doing over $8 million. Is
Yeah.
this possible?
Right.
And then bit by bit, the consternation and the fear and anxiety began to subside as we realized, well, actually, maybe that wasn't the full story. Maybe it was not the case that they spent 8 million, that maybe there was a lot more involved here, that maybe there was a degree of IP theft that was involved, what we've gotten used to with the Chinese, very much so, that this
Oh
is
yeah.
part of their modus operandi
Yep.
in carrying it out, is stealing from the innovative and then putting it to use in their productive capacity. But you
Right.
know what struck me about that story, Leslie, was it was what made it seem credible when it first came out is because we would expect an American company to do something like that, or
Mm,
a Western company to find a way to turn a platform which costs tens of billions of dollars and to do it for $8 million. It's the kind of a miracle change that you expect
yeah.
from American companies and happens with American companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gave it, I think, for a moment, there was that sort of credibility that with it, because it's a familiar story to us. but
Interesting.
it's not something that's how the Chinese work. And that's why I think in the end, they're going to lose this competition.
Mm,
Because I think in the end, the real power of innovation and productivity flowing together, the synergy of these two things
hmm.
flows. That synergy is found in the West, in America, and the West, and our democratic allies. It's not found in China, and it certainly isn't found in China's allies.
Right.
Russia, North Korea, come on. Who are we talking about? We're thinking about innovative, high tech thinking.
Yeah.
Um, America has powerful allies that could be brought in and be part of this new renaissance of our defense industrial base together
Hmm.
in ways that we're just beginning to explore right now.
Right. Well, can you do you have any examples of that? Because that's really what we want to be able to explore with the upcoming event. And we have representation from Ukraine, Estonia, Germany, the US, UK, really trying to get a very broad look at what we all need to do together to tackle this problem. First to acknowledge the problem and then to tackle it.
Yeah,
You know
first
what?
acknowledge the problem and then tackle it.
Right, exactly.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you a quick sketch pad look at one. And we can talk about cooperation in AI. We can talk about in quantum. I do a lot of work on quantum
Mhm.
technology, and there's enormous opportunities for partnering with countries in the West and in Asia in that development. We could talk about space. We could talk about even hypersonics if
Right.
we wanted to. But let's take a more conventional area of where defense industrial base is in serious difficulties in this country, and that's shipbuilding.
Yes.
We've already seen that underway with the last administration, with the outreach both to Korea and to Japan,
Hmm.
for thinking about ways how to help to rebuild our maritime industrial base, which
Yes.
is, after all, the foundation for a navy, for navy shipbuilding and
Yep.
sea power industrial base in the same way.
Hmm.
But reaching out to the South Koreans and to the Japanese, it doesn't have to stop there. There are plenty of partners, including NATO partners like Denmark,
Hmm.
who are engaged in some very innovative work with regard to shipbuilding, of knowing how to move from building commercial vessels and adapting that to military vessel construction. We
Right.
can also look even to Israel, which
Hmm.
has a very successful track record in building ships for control over waterways of what we would call green water and
Mm.
brown water,
Hmm.
maritime dominance and superiority.
Yeah.
There's a host of places that we can go. The process has begun in a kind of government to government level. What
Right.
I would like to see in all of these areas, AI and quantum and hypersonics and space, is more encouragement of company to company connections,
Yeah.
and in order to build and to fulfill the objectives that
Yeah.
both of our defense postures, that both of our militaries are going to need in the future.
Right. Well, that's actually something, in our final minutes together, one of the things that I was looking for as I was reading the book, and you answered it in your writing, was that people were concerned about that it was just big business getting all of these contracts, and that Bill Knudsen was actually very comfortable with that because he understood what subcontractors would be involved and how many thousands of subcontractors would be involved in
That's
every
exactly
single
right.
project.
That states it perfectly. Right.
And to me, building on what you just said about the partnerships of company to company, um, with startups, in this defense and security space, we're seeing a lot of partnerships being made very, very early on, not just startup to prime, which is actually a really hard partnership to establish,
Very
but
difficult.
to startup to come join their their products together to be able to become some type of like program of record. And so we're seeing companies like Helsing, they now just announced that they're having a partnership with Mistral, but they also had partnerships with drone companies to be able to make the HX2 that they unveiled just before Christmas. Like it's these types of relationships are critical for startups to be able to scale and be able to compete for government contracts, but also to be able to support this, lower level within where the primes are very established. Is as we're seeing these startups getting involved in defense, is that unique to current day, or were there equivalents, that you uncovered when you were writing Freedom's Forge, in rapid innovators in the lead up to World War II?
Rapid innovators and very small companies too. In fact, I have a whole chapter in Freedom's Forge about the really almost tiny, mom and pop size outfits that found themselves becoming and pushed themselves into becoming part of the military industrial complex, the arsenal of democracy as it was taking shape
Mm-hmm.
here. And that there was always a niche, a little place that to do it better, faster, quicker, cheaper would give you that opportunity to do that and to succeed in it. My own view about this, and this is shaped by both the history that I outlined in Freedom's Forge, but also I think of watching how defense industrial base matters have proceeded since the Cold War as well, is that what is particularly challenging for startups trying to enter into the sphere of defense industrial base and seeking out contracts and developing it is that things move so slowly in the public arena, in the government area. Again, goes back to my model, right? Mm-hmm. Entrepreneurs make things happen. Government makes sure things don't happen. Mm-hmm. And part of that is being this extra special care, which from the outside looks like slow rolling. Right. It goes into contracting and work that goes with that for mm-hmm. small businesses, extremely frustrating, but which is particularly, I think, the where it becomes a real challenge is when they realize that their livelihoods are going to be affected by this slow process, that they simply can't wait 2 to 3 years for a contract to finally come through, mm-hmm. And therefore they shy away from getting involved in public business altogether and right. working with a Defense Department or a Ministry of Defense. It's just too expensive. We just can't afford to sit around and wait.
Right.
Here. And I think part of the change that has to happen is from public authorities who need to realize that a company or a startup's commercial possibilities aren't a distraction from its main business that it's trying to work with for the Ministry of Defense or Defense Department mm-hmm. here. That may be, in fact, key to what they bring to what you need to accomplish, and why you're looking at them in the first place, to mm-hmm. sign a contract, to develop a technology, to improve an existing technology, or bring on an emerging technology. Mm-hmm. That their prospects for commercial success and the way in which they think about the world in terms of how to make a lot of money doing what we're doing and have fun at the same time, that may be exactly the mentality you want to bring over to your side. Whether it's a contract with the Navy, a contract with the Army, contract with the Air Force. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of attitude you want to have and get involved here as mm-hmm. well. And as you know as well, Leslie, you know this as well as I do, this is also how you get the venture capital people mm-hmm. involved and investing in and developing these kinds of companies and the systems that they foster and put forward as well here too. The conflict between making the world secure and making money while doing it shouldn't be seen as irreconcilable.
Right.
That we have to realize that those two things, in fact, go together very, very well and fit together, particularly in free democratic societies. Mm-hmm. That was the key to the success of World War II, getting the private sector and commercial businesses involved in it, to make the best use of their talents and drive and energy. And it's going to be, I believe, I'm firmly convinced, it's going to be the key to success of reviving our defense industrial bases across the West, not just in America, but with our NATO allies and beyond.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really great to have you. We'll have to have you back to carry on the conversation sometime.
I look forward to that very much. Thanks, Leslie.
Amazing.